So, Prabhu, you have traveled quite a bit, grew up in India. Uh, I'm curious to know what gave birth to the intellectual curiosity that you possess, and how has it evolved over time?
I think the root of it was quite personal. I was never a particularly brilliant student, at least not till I got to university. And the root of my intellectual curiosity was a very deep personal question. My father had died when I was 8, as I said, and so I became an atheist, a very militant kind of atheist of 8, if you can imagine that, in a traditional conservative society like India. And I was quite rude, I think, to a lot of people. Sadly, I must say that, because I would be almost insultingly questioning, asking questions like, well, how do you know God exists? And why would you do something like that? This is meaningless, this sort of stuff. So this phase of my life continued till I got to my teenage years. And when I got to my teenage years, I realized, because I really started thinking, that this kind of attitude was okay as a kind of protest, emotional protest against God's nastiness to me, as I thought of it then. But then I realized that atheism does not actually give you any answers. Because atheism doesn't tell you why the universe exists, it doesn't tell you why you exist, it doesn't tell you what the purpose of life is, it doesn't tell you what is good and bad, right and wrong, should you study or not study, should you murder or bless, it doesn't tell you any of these things. It's like saying, this animal here is not an elephant. Okay, it's not an elephant, but that doesn't tell you what it is, right?
Right, okay.
So it's a bit like that. So I started searching. This does not mean that God exists. This does not mean God exists. It just means that if you want to find the meaning of life, then you have to somehow resolve the question of whether God exists, and if so, what kind of God that might be. And so I started looking. So I went to temples, I went to mosques, because obviously, it had something to do with religion, and where better than India to find answers to a religious question, as I thought of it then. So I went and I talked to all kinds of priests and so on. So there was a spiritual side to that, of course, but there was also an intellectual side to that. And the intellectual side to it was very important, because I wanted intellectually persuasive, convincing answers. And as I got into that, I won't go into the spiritual side of my story, because in Indian tradition we don't talk about that sort of thing very publicly. But the intellectual side of it was very interesting, because it got me involved in looking at history, philosophy, mythology, reading modern writers, like modern within quote marks compared to our tradition, like Karl Marx and the existentialist writers who were very popular when I was growing up. And really that got me then into all kinds of other areas over time. Science, and what science was discovering, and what science could tell us and what science can't tell us, all these kinds of things. So the result was that when I was a child, growing up 13, 14, 15, 16, which is kind of school age, my mental energy was completely devoted to things that were irrelevant to my studies.
Ah.
And even when I got to university, a lot of my mental energy was devoted to other things than my studies. So I did okay at school. I did much better at university. And really, it was only much later than university, as I continued pursuing these intellectual interests, that I think, came into my own. So I was a kind of very late developer. But the result of that has been that, I've published on Indian history, I've published on Indian mythology, I've published on Indian legends, I've published on Indian spirituality, I've published on sort of aspects of Indian art, aspects of Indian culture, and obviously my professional fields, which are more in the areas of economics and politics and technology than anything else.